Young. I'm a second year PhD student at MIT, currently working at the intersection of machine learning and material discovery. Thank you everyone for joining us here today at MIT CEO's Winter Night. Today we have something really special for you, where we try out a new virtual event format. In addition to a typical keynote presentation, we will have partners from Tsingyuan Ventures hosting one-on-one office hour sessions and provide personal advice to early stage startups. Now, quickly, we'll have an intro of our organization given by co-president Wendy Ni.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. So my name is Wendy, co-president of MIT CEO. Before the event starts, I just want to give a very brief introduction of our student group. So MIT CEO is a student organization at MIT that brings together people interested in entrepreneurship, startups, or just interested in learning about what's the next big innovative companies coming up. So we have over 1,000 community members in field-specific communities in AI, biotech and healthcare, energy, fintech, property tech, etc. So during the pandemic, we have been utilizing Zoom to its full potential. So we have over 3 to 5 events every month. So if you like today's talk, please subscribe to our newsletter or follow up official account on WeChat. So I've seen Eric has done a super great job doing that. We should have that too. I'll keep that in mind next time. So awesome. I'll give the time back to Harry.
Thank you, Wendy. This is awesome. So our presentation today will last roughly 40 minutes with focus on AI-centric startups that take advantage of not only breakthroughs, innovations in the US, but also the speed and scale-up potential in China. We're pleased to have our guest speaker, Mr. Eric Rosenblum, today with us. He's a managing partner at Tsingyuan Ventures, and he would like to share his perspectives on the trends towards global movement of intellectual capital, disruptive impact of AI on software industry, and a new playbook spanning both US and Chinese markets. An alumni of Harvard and MIT Sloan, Eric has held senior product director positions at Google and Palantir, and has been on the executive team of multiple successful tech startups prior to joining Tsingyuan Ventures. Let's welcome Eric.
First, thank you guys so much. I really love MIT CEO. I think you guys are doing such a fantastic job bridging the community there with technology. It's a really well-organized student group. So, thank you again for having me. As you said, Harry, I also am an alumnus of MIT. I also think there probably may be some people from down the road at Harvard. My undergraduate is Harvard, so I wish I were there in person. I miss Boston. Although Palo Alto is probably a little bit nicer this time of year normally. Although I hear you guys are having a nice fall day. So let me kick this off and just first just want to say a lot of people on this call, if you have questions, just put them in the chat. I'll keep the chat menu open. And if appropriate, I can take a break and answer questions, but I may wait till the end and just kind of stack everything. But obviously don't be shy, just fire in the questions. And if we don't have time to get to it during this session, then hopefully I'll get back to everyone at some point. Great. So first, I just want to repeat who we are. In addition to myself, Tsingyuan Ventures, we're a $100 million seed stage venture firm. We only invest in North America. And I say that because we're obviously talking a lot about China and the US. We invest, though, in companies that usually have strong technical differentiation. So we don't invest in just plain business models or apps. We normally invest in companies that have true technology at the core. And we're pretty broad. We invest in software, we invest in life sciences, we invest in material science. So in general, we look across a pretty wide variety of companies. Okay. So we think that the cross-border playbook is powerful. We don't only invest in companies that do this cross-border playbook, but we think it's an incredibly powerful thing when it works. And we'll be talking about that tonight. About 75% of our portfolio have PhD founders, and about 65% have founders originally from China. So obviously, this also has to do with what we're going to discuss tonight. As for myself, Harry already gave a brief intro, but the partners almost all came to the States from China in the 1990s to get PhDs of our firm. I'm exactly the opposite. So I graduated from Harvard in 1992, and then I went to China the next week, and I thought I would only be there for about a year. but I ended up staying for almost 14 years. First, I was lucky enough to be part of the landing party for BCG in China. And then I started my first company, which was a small media company in Shanghai that did okay, but it got me a taste for entrepreneurship. So I was part of a much more successful and larger venture that was one of the first private payment networks in China that was bought by Ping An Group. When I came back to the States, I was lucky enough to be at Google, and I was running part of the product team for commerce. And one of my chief engineers was a member of the Teak Angel Fund and also Teak, the Tsingyuan Entrepreneur Executive Club. And we really liked working together. So at first I became an investor into this fund, then eventually joined up full time. And part of it was that I really believe in this cross-border cooperation. And it was something that was important to my life and I think important in the world of venture. So the things I want to talk about today, I want to talk about the significance of the rise of AI, its impact on business models, and then the relationship between China and the West with regards to AI in particular, and then the playbook that's coming out from this relationship and this disruption. And in venture, you're always looking for major disruptions, and this is a big one that's happening. Now, first and foremost, AI is not really its own category. It's in everything. So as venture firm, we see maybe, I'd say 30 or 40 companies per week. In software, we almost never see a company that's not using AI anymore. So anything that uses data or anything that helps make decisions, it helps us write. So we see AI startups doing everything from obviously grammar, but also drafting legal contracts, translating our work, reading our MRIs and PET scans, driving our cars, handling our investment accounts. It's literally going to be in everything. And this is different from the last big thing. So big data was something that we were all talking about 7 or 8 years ago. This quote is a little naughty, but I think it's about right. Dan Ariely, who's great if you haven't read him, he said, big data is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it. No one really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everybody else is doing it, so everyone claims they're doing it. And everyone was claiming they were a big data startup back in the day, but no one really knew what that meant, and it wasn't really in everything. AI is different. It really is now in everything. Now, the economic impact is going to be enormous, and this is one of those times where when you put up big numbers, usually there's some skepticism about this. In AI, I have no doubt that the impact to the world economy will be very, very large. So an oft-cited figure is 15.7 trillion by PricewaterhouseCoopers. That's a big percentage of the overall global GDP. And specifically, China will be taking a big chunk, so 7 trillion versus North America with about almost 4 trillion. So these two economies together take the vast share, but China in particular is going to benefit. Now, I just have to acknowledge, I've already quoted Dan Ariely, and I highly recommend people read him. I love Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI Superpowers. And a lot of my thought has been shaped by some of his observations in working between Silicon Valley and China. So I highly recommend you read this. And some of my thinking may mirror some of his thinking. So first, and he made this point, that true breakthroughs happen extremely rarely and by a very small number of people. And in the world of AI specifically, we're talking about these three gentlemen, Geoffrey Hinton, Yoshia Bengio, and Yen LeCun, the three godfathers who shared the Turing Award. Now, their seminal work was really on deep networks and neural networks, and they explored it in a paper in 1986. And so the work that they got the Turing Award for just in the last few years came from work that took place in the 80s. And they suggested a breakthrough approach. And it took about 20 years for their team to show practical impacts and practical breakthroughs. Now, along the way, there's been a lot of enabling technologies that now let anyone take advantage of this initial theoretical breakthrough. So obviously, we all use TensorFlow. There's AI-optimized chips. There's automated data labeling and cleansing. And this list can go on for dozens and dozens of categories. But the takeaway is you don't really expect to have very many fundamental breakthroughs. Everything in between is application. And so what we see generally when we see a new startup it's not that they found a fundamental breakthrough in AI. They're using all of the same tools and systems that everybody else is, but they have a novel application. And normally, when we evaluate that company, we're trying to figure out how do they get a data advantage faster than somebody else that will lead to a lasting advantage. Now, this is where China comes in. The top AI researchers, as we mentioned, they're in Montreal, Toronto, MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, CMU, et cetera. But more and more of these researchers are actually from China, but they're making their careers in the States. And I'll go into this in a moment, but just to give a quick fast forward, 18% of PhDs in STEM subjects in the US are from China, and they tend to be concentrated in certain subspecialties, and AI is one of those. Meanwhile, back in China, there's a massive advantage in the scale and speed of adoption of data-intensive activities. So if you look at food delivery, they're already at 10x the US. If you look at e-commerce, it's 2x, but a much faster growth rate. Rideshare is already at 4x. Bike share is 100x. Mobile payments are 50x. Now, all of these applications that I just mentioned have a few things that are interesting from an AI and data standpoint. First, they always have personal identification. So food delivery, e-commerce, et cetera, will have your address. It has preferences. What kind of food do you like? What kinds of transactions do you make? What point do you go to what point? Huge amounts of data that can be mined, both from a geospatial standpoint, transactional, preference, et cetera. And so what this means is there are many companies in China that are working with data sets far larger than their counterparts in the US, and they're growing even faster. So you put these two things together, you put a huge number of researchers in the US who are from China originally, with the scale of data and speed back in China, and it leads to an interesting phenomenon. There are companies that are based here in the US. They're taking advantage of China for speed and adoption. I'll just name a few, and these are all from our portfolio. And by the way, in the teaser for this, we talked about Pony.ai, Too Simple. We're not investing in all of these. They're just using a similar playbook. These companies are all in our portfolio. So Turing Video was founded by a PhD from USC named Cao Song, another PhD from UCLA named Xing. And they basically are applying computer vision to physical security. So their belief was that the mode of having a security guard sitting watching a monitor all day is going to be a thing of the past, that you're going to have smart video analytics in the future. Now, in the States, when they were selling this kind of idea, they would get corporate campuses to try, and they would let them use 1 or 2 video cameras at a time to see how the system works. They also have a robot that patrols in parking lots, and they might try a robot for a few months and see how that works. But their first deal in China was with the Wanda Group. Wanda's first deal with them was for 15,000 cameras. So as a result, today, Turing Video, which has order of magnitude 100,000 live camera fees, has a data advantage over every other company in this sector that is trying to do smart video analytics, because they're able to take advantage of both the US fundamental scientific breakthroughs with China's scale. And for a business like this, having a data advantage is very difficult for competitors to overcome. Subtle Medical is very similar. Interestingly, the founder of Subtle Medical, Gong Hao and Cao Song, were the same department from Tsinghua. They both came to the States for their PhDs. Gong Hao was at Stanford. Now, whereas Cao Song applied computer vision to security and monitoring, Gong Hao applied it to MRIs and PET scans. So when you enter an MRI, first, it's very claustrophobic. It takes a lot of time for them to get a good image. Now, if you could enhance the image with AI, you could potentially make a much better quality image with much less time in this very expensive machine. Now, all medical devices, it's a race to get FDA approval. And so in this case, you can also use China, where clinics may be faster to adopt new technologies. So you can build a data set that will allow you to submit your FDA application faster. So as a result, Subtle Medical was the first company in America to get FDA approval for both MRI and PET scans. And they're now kind of off to the races, selling their system into hospitals everywhere. Plus.ai, which is the leader in self-driving trucks. Again, it's based in the Bay Area. Founders originally from China, but Stanford grads. They're going for first the Chinese self-driving truck market, but then they stunned the world and they drove an entire container load of butter coast to coast with no human intervention. They had a safety driver sitting there. But what you realize was they've collected so much data from doing self-driving trucks in China that they're probably, at this moment, have a better data set than any of the US players. So they are looking to compete in both markets. WeRide, on the other hand, is going for robo-taxis, also was based in Sunnyvale and founded in Sunnyvale, but is going for the Chinese robo-taxi market and now has the largest fleet of self-driving taxis in the world, I think, and the largest in China that are now operating in Guangzhou. And then yet a completely other business, ZSFab, which is making highly custom 3D printed joints and exoskeletons, also using AI to help with the imaging and help with the matrix that you use for biocompatible materials. So if you just look at this sheet, it's a huge range of businesses: security, medical imaging, self-driving cars, medical implants, all powered by AI, all running essentially the same playbook. And I could have listed 20 other companies here that are all doing a similar kind of playbook. So the elements of the playbook, there's 4 main parts. The first one's the most obvious: cross-border talent. Eric Yuan from Zoom did this from day one. He rose through the ranks at WebEx in China, and then he came to the States to run engineering for WebEx that then got bought by Cisco. And he was very familiar running a Chinese engineering team. As a result, he immediately offshored his team. He was operating at a cost advantage versus others, and then became profitable very quickly. But this is very common. And so when people think of cross-border play, often a lot of that's just outsourcing the talent. But I think even more importantly are the next few things. The cross-border pilots. Chinese companies are often more willing to use beta software, early stage medical devices. And so you can get up to speed faster. Now there's a downside to that. They're also willing to trial your competitors. So once you have a customer in China, they may not be a customer for very long because they're constantly challenge you, which can be good and bad. It makes you better, but it means less stability. On the other hand, the US is exactly the opposite. It takes you a long time to get your first pilot, but once you get your pilot, they often don't churn. And so taking advantage of these two sides, where you get fast beta customers, while you get sticky enterprise customers in the US, can also be very powerful. Cross-border data, I just mentioned, the scale of data in China is often orders of magnitude higher. And then finally, and it should be obvious, but cross-border funding. So Chinese investors are very active in some of the same areas like AI, but they're more active in certain other areas. So if you're material science or robotics or certain kinds of hardware, it may not be a popular investment category in the US, but in China, it may be more popular. So I believe, and I think there's evidence for this, that the relationship between the two markets has shifted. They used to be viewed as very separate, and more they're extensions of each other. Now, part of the reason why we used to think of them as separate is because of high-profile failures, in particular of US companies entering China. So, famously, Google and Yahoo and Alibaba and others all failed against local competition. But I think that many of those were consumer-driven companies. And it's very difficult to compete in a different culture, different landscape that's competitive on the consumer side. Everything that we just showed are more enterprise and more data type plays. And so I think that there is a change happening right now. There's a couple of things that are driving this. One is the pattern of knowledge migration, meaning people like you guys, people that have come to the States, have international life. And so they're starting their careers in the US, but they're very comfortable living and working in China. And this has partially also been driven by non-state actors. So you have big multinational companies. So in particular, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. So those self-driving car companies that are based in Sunnyvale but working in China, their leaders almost all came out of Andrew Ng's lab in Sunnyvale for Baidu. And that's why they're based in Sunnyvale. So if you look at Pony.ai, Roadstar, which is now out of business, but similar story, WeRide, their leaders all came through this lab. And that's why, and their kids are, by the way, now in school at Cupertino High. They are going to be living in the States, but their company, their biggest opportunity is in China. And that's new. And it's because of these multinational giants where talent is now all over the world and people are more accustomed to working with each other. So I want to talk a little bit about what's been happening in the States. And it's something that I think most people on this call probably understand really well, but may not have researched. It's something I was just interested in personally, was how big is this market and what is going to happen in the future? So first to note is that the number of US science and engineering PhDs has risen a lot in the last 30 years. So if you look, I'm getting a note that my internet connection is unstable. So if people are having trouble hearing, send me a note in the chat and I'll try to address my internet connection somehow. Meanwhile, the proportion of non-US citizens has been changing. So back in 1980s, it was only 25%. Today it's 40%. So not only do you have 3 times the number of PhD students, we have a much higher percentage of non-US citizen. And they cap the non-US citizen side. So that group is much more competitive to get a slot in. Now, the composition has been changing a lot. So if you look back in the 80s, there were very few Chinese PhDs actually. And in fact, this year that I found data for, 1987, it was one of the smaller countries. There were more from India, more from Korea, many more from Taiwan, and more from a lot of other countries. 20 years later, you have a completely different situation. China is by far the largest source, and Taiwan is the only country that's actually shrunk. So, you know, there's something interesting that's going on, both in terms of absolute numbers, but also the relative proportions. And the final thing about these groups that I think is quite interesting is the type of person coming is different. So again, if you look in 1987, most of the people that were coming from China, India, Korea, Taiwan, they were fairly similar. About half or less than half of their parents even had bachelor's degrees. India is a little bit more. The others are all less than half. Taiwan is significantly less than half. And very few of them had parents that had PhDs. If you look at their US citizen counterparts though, it's different. More than a quarter of their US citizen counterparts, even back then, had PhDs. So the American counterparts were like an entrenched class of academics. 20 years later, all these other countries have changed. So the proportion of Indian PhD students who have parents that are well-educated is very high. Korea and Taiwan have both risen quite a lot. The US has risen a lot in the sense that more than half the American-born PhD students have parents who also have PhDs, which is stunning to me. But China hasn't changed. These are still the kids of parents who don't have college degrees. And there is something fundamentally different about that kind of person who goes abroad to study. So, what is the result of all this? I find this fascinating. If you look at any company in America that was founded by a Chinese person before the year 2000, almost all of them are people from Taiwan, Hong Kong, or even Vietnam. In the case of Lam Research, who's a Chinese immigrant, but from Vietnam. The ones from mainland China actually came before the formation of the PRC. So An Wang from Wang Labs came over in the 50s, or came over before the 50s. Computer Associates is another example of that. Those from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and others have some characteristics that are common. These are chip companies, hardware companies, routers, very famous names here. So ViewSonic, Garmin, Vizio, Linksys, NVIDIA, et cetera. And they have that in common. If you flash forward 10 years though, and go to 2000 onward, it suddenly changes. So first, from mainland China, you have WebEx, which is very significant to us. That had, as CTO was, or as a co-founder was Zhumin, who comes over from Zhejiang. He brought over Eric Yuan from Zoom. And so that has a significant tie between the two. NetScreen, which is Deng Feng, and Fortinet with Ken Xie, came over from Tsinghua, got their PhDs here in the States. They were the founders of, they're founding members of Teak, so important to our own firm's story. Palo Alto Networks had a co-founder from China, Aerohive Networks, Liu Changming. We're actually backing his new company, which we hope will be a big logo up here soon enough as well, also from Tsinghua. Now, in contrast, the companies founded from Taiwan or Hong Kong during this era are all kids who came over as children. Their parents came over for their PhD programs or for their jobs. So this is Jerry Yang from Yahoo, Steve Chen from YouTube. These are no longer people emigrating to the US to get their PhDs. They're just coming with their parents as 5-year-olds. So a very different kind of immigrant now. Flash forward 10 more years, and it's totally different. It's very hard now to find a company with a Taiwanese or Hong Kong immigrant founder in the US. On the other hand, look at the top. Neuro, which is last mile delivery. They just raised a huge round. I think it was $300 or $500 million round. Quanergy, which is a $2.2 billion solid state LiDAR company. DeepMap, which is a leader in mapping for self-driving. I should take Roadstar out. I think it's dead now. Otter, which is also in our portfolio, which is the leading transcription service. Too Simple for trucking. WeRide. I think someone's on this call who is from Covariant. I think is one of the most interesting companies, industrial robots. Plus.ai, Pony.ai, even Limebike. So all of a sudden, you have this wave of companies that have founders who are originally from the PRC that are leading their sectors. All of these have a significant AI component or are enabling AI applications. Now, a few remarks about that group of companies that I just showed. There's a strong relationship between them and some of the non-state actors. So Neuro, you have Jia Junju from Google Self-Driving. James Wu, who came out DeepMap, it came out of Google and Apple Maps and Baidu. Pony, James Peng, came out of Google Ads actually, and then Baidu Self-Driving. Tony Han from WeRide came from Baidu Self-Driving. Sam Liang came out of Google. And there are many more of these. A lot of these companies and the people that are able to take advantage of this kind of new globalism came out of global non-state actors themselves. So just a couple of thoughts and conclusions, then I'd be happy to take questions. The first is deep learning-based AI is one of the most fundamental value drivers in the world. I think it's similar in impact to, quote, the internet or the mobile phone, where we no longer think about companies as being internet companies or mobile companies. It's just fundamental to everything we do. And AI is one of those building blocks. I believe that China and the US have very complementary roles, and it's only growing more entwined. And so even though we talk about decoupling and the stress between China and the US, I think that the nature of these two regions, particularly on technical innovation tied to data, is very difficult to untangle. That the big 7 corporations that I mentioned in both the US and China may be even more important than the nation states when you think about competitive dynamics, meaning even if the situation between the US and China becomes more tense, that the role of a Google or a Baidu may be just as important as whatever we do at the national level. And on a personal note, I think the current direction of government policies, the kind of arms race mentality, is really a big mistake. It's destructive for everybody involved. No one wins in the arms race mentality. And finally, the global perspective really should inform the next generation of startups. So if people are sitting there listening to this, thinking about starting a company, I do advise to think about the global perspective, where you can take advantage of the complementary nature of different economies. And that if you can take advantage of these differences, then you have a big advantage in being able to build your own company. So I'm going to stop there. I'll stop sharing my screen. Like I said, happy to answer questions. You can also follow us on LinkedIn or WeChat. We answer questions to that channel as well at any time. We're easy to find. But happy to queue up any questions that you might have. And by the way, just as a side note, we're doing something a little special tonight. We've never done this before. We're holding office hours. So several of us, partners at the firm and others, are going to be answering Teams questions. we're going to try to do this occasionally. So if you didn't sign up this time, we'll do this periodically. But it's an experiment to do quick 15-minute interactions where we can give you guys feedback on the ventures that you want to start. So with that, I'm just reading off some of the questions. Okay, so we'll talk about the impact of FIRMA and CFIUS is the first question that I have here. This is a big one. And so I want to give some background to people who may not be familiar. CFIUS stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, and it's an old body. It actually was formed in the 1970s under the US Department of Treasury back when we were really worried about Japan. So back in those days, we formed this group that was really supposed to evaluate whether or not various Japanese interests coming into the US should be allowed to buy up US assets. But in theory, it's really about foreign investment in the US, although it was formed under a different regime. In the last few years, CFIUS has really been about China. And the Trump administration pushed through a set of regulations known as FIRMA, which is an acronym about modernization of this rule. And what they did was they took the controls of CFIUS, which used to be about controlling of assets, and changed it to be about information. So it used to be that if you made small investments, it was okay as long as you didn't control the company. But they changed the definition of control to be about information. And they specified a certain number of areas, including a lot of AI kind of applications, but it's really kind of sensitive areas for national security. It's a big issue. It's made it so that Chinese investors have a difficult time investing in any hot deal in the US. They have to submit an application that is subject to 90-day review. If it gets rejected, then they can't invest. If they choose not to submit, then they can get in trouble. There's various fines, the deal will get unwound, et cetera. So as a result, a lot of investors from China left and went back to China. And that includes GenFund US, Ariza, Daohua Capital, Sinovation Ventures, which is Kai-Fu Lee's fund. These are all going concerns, but they decided that the US would not be their focus anymore. And then others also had some impact. So it's had quite a big impact. And so my advice is you really have to know the sector you're in and know if it is subject to CFIUS restrictions. There's nothing wrong with taking Chinese money, but you have to structure it so they get no information rights. And so you can structure your deals so that they have no access to any technical information, no private information, that they're completely passive. So for example, Baidu Ventures, when they make investments in the US now, they have to agree that they'll get no information. So as an entrepreneur, actually, that's sometimes good. You don't have to give them a board seat. It might not be a bad thing. But it's definitely changed the way Chinese investment in the US works. Next question, let's see. Are there any emerging regulation of major concern similar to financial regulations announced in China? Yeah, so I think that this question may be related to the previous question, FIRMA and CFIUS. So I won't go further down that unless there's something different. There's a question about AI's role in drug discovery. I'm not an expert in this area. We do have people on our team that work specifically on drug discovery. It seems like it will be profound, though. So that AI, actually, we're seeing it in both drug discovery and material science. So new material discovery innovation. And we've seen several startups in these areas. AI and drug discovery has already spawned a couple of very large companies. And I believe every pharma and many CROs are incorporating AI into their drug research platforms. So I think that it's got a pretty pervasive role in drug discovery. But that's something that, Rob, I know that who asked the question, Rob Young, I think is meeting with Dr. Jean Zhang on our team, and she could speak a lot more to that. Oh yeah, so there's been a request to share slides. So this this whole talk is being recorded, so I think that is going to be posted. So I should have said that earlier. Han Su has asked, what visa do Chinese founders usually hold in the US? That's a good question. I don't actually know. I'll bet others on this call probably do know that. Shuhui, are you able to answer, or does someone else know? Yeah, I actually don't know. That's a good question. I should find out.
Very well.
What's that?
I don't know for sure, because I'm not a legal background.
Huang Song has asked, can you share some thoughts on, or I'm sorry, I was going to flip to a different one. Sorry, Ben Ma asked, can you predict new trends with the new president? So I have some ideas, but I'm not sure I'm right. But I'll just, first, I think it'll be very different from President Trump. My personal belief is that President Trump had a group in his inner circle whose ambition was to try to force regime change in China, meaning, the fall of the Communist Party. And regardless of what your view is of whether that's right or wrong, that was probably what motivated the policies. They weren't trying to strike an economic deal. They were trying to basically impede China's rise for a lot of reasons. The Biden regime will most likely return to something that is more normal for the US, which is trade-centric. So there'll probably be an attempt to go back to more normal bilateral trade. So I think you'll see an end to this trade war, because it has not been helpful for the US, it hasn't been helpful for China. But there'll be a renegotiation of a lot of the US-China trade relationship, more around technology. There is a recognition that the relationship between the two countries has changed a lot. On the other hand, I think the national security concerns the US has will continue through a Biden administration. So I don't think the tension will ease that much. I think that the FIRMA restrictions and CFIUS will stay in place. So everything we just talked about in terms of Chinese investment in the US, I think that will remain. I think it'll still be difficult, but I think the trade war will end. And I think the tension will be ratcheted down a fair bit. There's a question, my consulting experience, how did it help my startup venture? Do you think consulting is a good prep for a startup today? So first, I just want to say, I was so lucky. I love BCG, and I love BCG in China. And when I went out there, it was brand new. Today, they would never hire someone like me. They wouldn't hire Lao Wai. They only hire people from local schools because they don't need someone like me. And so I was very lucky to be able to be at BCG in China during those years. The training is excellent, and I think it's quite good for startups. However, I'll say this. I think consultants tend to be a little too analytical in some ways. And a lot of successful entrepreneurs tend to be driven and follow their instincts and gut a bit more. And part of the reason I say that is the probability of success as an entrepreneur is so low that if you are conservative at all or analytical at all, it's very likely to not do it. And so it is somewhat of an impediment to becoming a successful entrepreneur. A lot of consultants play the role of COO and kind of head of strategy, head of operations at startups. And I think that's quite common. But I learned a lot from BCG. I think if people think about getting training to be good at management, a top consulting firm is a great route. Huang Song reposted. He said, I want to, do you think influence marketers, i.e. video shopping, will become big in the near future in the US, given that it's already very popular in China today? This is interesting. VCs always joke that a lot of startups, the business plan takes the form of Uber for X, or X for Y. And so people love just adopting a known business model and then doing a permutation of that business model. The Pinot Noir for America comes up all the time, but I've never seen someone actually make a serious attempt at this. I don't know. I kind of think that China's shopping habits are dramatically different from US shopping habits. And so I'm a little skeptical. Just by way of background, we don't invest in B2C at Tsingyuan, partially because we think we understand technology really well. And our partnership has a group of people that have, again, PhDs in everything from machine learning to material science to oncology to neurobiology. But we don't feel like we really understand, video-driven shopping behavior. But I personally am a little skeptical that consumer models travel very well between countries. And I think that was part of the problem, frankly, when Google or Amazon or Yahoo or others tried to get into China, was it's much harder when there's a cultural element to something to succeed. So to answer the question directly, I think it's tough, but I know a lot of people are trying. Yixing Jiang is asking, what are your thoughts on the trends of AI robotics across the US and China? So this is a pretty popular category. And in fact, a lot of these teams are China-US teams. So we saw Team XYZ out of CMU that now is basically based in China. I mentioned Covariant, which is based in Berkeley, but is a team of largely Chinese engineers. There's quite a few cross-border teams in this segment. They fall into a bunch of different areas. There's a lot of pick and pack robotics, meaning they work warehouses and pick things off of bins, pack them. There's also warehouse automation. So for example, one of the companies that I think has a good shot of going from China to the US is Geek Plus, which is essentially like a Kiva type system. If you know the little robots that pick up shelving and move them around warehouses. I think this category is going to be huge. However, at the moment, there's so much custom work that it takes to make them actually work effectively. So every time you enter a warehouse, you essentially have a giant consulting job to do before your system actually works. And when you compare that amount of work to selling software, and you sell millions of copies of software with no friction, versus having to do enterprise sales with a major warehouse provider, and then do a consulting project with them, and then maybe win that, and then hope to get to the second project, they're very capital intensive and very labor intensive. And so it's going to be a little while, but I think that this is quite a good category, and we're very enthusiastic about it. So I don't know if that answers Yixing's question, but we like the trend. We think this is a cross-border category.
Yeah, maybe I can share some like context, because I'm curious, because I'm seeing like so like there's the novel robot. They are like the kind of like home cleaning robots. I'm not like novel, NARWAL. That like it's kind of like booming in China, right? Like I'm just seeing like a bunch of like consumer AI robotics company growing up in China, and then for example, there is a 9 robot kind of like acquiring Segway a few years ago.
Yeah, 9bot.
Like, yeah, it seems like all these like consumer level robotics company, or maybe in the future like enterprise level and robotics company, like they're just booming in China, and then like they can control the cost so well because of Chinese manufacturing, and then like it seems like it might be taking like over like US competitors in the future. I just feel like what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I mentioned, we don't do any consumer facing business.
I see.
But that, again, in terms of these cross-border plays, the idea that you can get up to manufacturing scale, lower cost. So 9bot buying Segway is a good example. Touring Video, the company I mentioned earlier, is built on top of the 9bot platform. And as a result, they have lower cost base, and it's a more robust robot than any of their competitors. So I do think that that's a great model. Obviously DJI is doing that model right now. And I think you will see, DJI already has quite a lot of AI capabilities around, route finding, mapping. And I think that there will be more and more smarts that are built into the system. And they'll be very hard to compete with from manufacturing cost base, scale, et cetera. I think will be quite difficult. So I do think this will be a trend, and there's opportunity, but we're not experts in this by any means.
Okay, thanks for sharing. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, and actually, since you guys are able to turn your mic, I wasn't even sure if people could turn their microphones on. So you should just ask your own questions. So let me go to next Anand. So Anand Chaturvedi has a question about cross-border style companies trying to conduct their IPO in the US. Is there any concern? Anand, do you want to ask a question, or do you want me just to go forward from here?
Sure. Yeah, I think you got the question right. I was curious because you mentioned, outside investments into these companies might be hard. I was wondering how, those companies going public inside the U.S.
Yeah. So all the companies I'm talking about are U.S. companies. And so they do expect to go IPO in the US. And so I don't think that will be an impediment. There may be a point where they get so big, depending on the direction of U.S.-China relations, where they have to make a choice. Are they, going to compete in China or compete in the U.S.? And so I think that will come up down the road. We're not there yet. All the companies I listed are all still, like in the case of Zoom, say, they're already quite big in China as well, but there will be some questions of whether or not they will be able to succeed, with all the restrictions the Chinese government may put on, et cetera. So I do think that there's a reckoning coming around, are they able to effectively compete in both markets? But a US listing, I don't think will be impeded. Let's see. So Johan Fang has a question around current AI applications, really useful, require huge amounts of data. It seems only big companies can create really useful AI products. Johan, do you want to give a little bit more detail on this?
Yeah, so I think the background is like because I think in China a lot of investors know about the AI sector is because the AlphaGo, like several years ago, and it's beat the human champion, the current champion, and then they used a huge amount of computation power. It's like tens of millions per year to build their network, and then of course they use a lot of data. And then for other companies like Taobao, they build a lot of, like Alibaba, they have a huge amount of user data, and so they can build a lot of AI stuff like with real applications. And then for other smaller companies, then they don't have the data and they don't have the computation power, and also the talents, right? Because a lot of companies, startup companies, are struggling to hire talents, and the top technology requires like top talents. Then there's a doubt about the ability for startups to do real AI stuff.
Yeah, I think it's a concern, but I think that the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, which is that there are a lot of pure startups that have had, like I said, I wouldn't call it necessarily a fundamental technical breakthrough because they haven't invented anything totally new, but they're leading their segments, and their segments can be big. So as an example, Otter.ai, so Sam Liang's company, he obviously came out of Google, and he is a top engineer, but they clearly now have the best transcription engine in the world. And because of that, they have a virtuous cycle where they're getting more and more speech samples, and they're getting better and better. And so what's on their roadmap are everything from meeting summarization, which takes a lot of AI and will be a big breakthrough. If you can summarize, not just transcribe, but actually summarize the important points, it's a big breakthrough. You'll be seeing things like simultaneous translation. So a lot of things that are well beyond what Google does today in the same area. And, to be honest, it's just because Google can't do everything. And so, for that, they're going to be the leader. Like I said, Turing video in computer vision for security is a big area. But again, Google or Amazon, they potentially could dominate the area, but they have a lot of other things to do. And so it is possible to have a good application that gets up to data scale faster than anybody else, and then continues to extend their lead. But I agree. If you want to work with truly large data sets from day one, then you join Amazon or you join Google. But there are a lot of startups that have accumulated huge amounts of data and are building the leading platforms in their area. So I'm not that pessimistic about it. Okay, so I think we'll do just 2 more questions, and then we're going to be doing a series of office hours after this. Like I said, if you didn't get to sign up this time, we'll be doing this again at some point in the future. Let's see. Peter Tong asked a question about data privacy. Peter, are you still on? Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I am on. I just wanted to kind of get your perspective on maybe the potential trends in terms of privacy of data, and is there going to be a barrier for entry for future startups practicing the practice of collecting large data, essentially?
Thanks. It's a great question. So I think that there is a trend towards the major regimes creating data privacy frameworks. So the U.S., EU, China will have their own framework. China does have its own framework, but these frameworks will continue to evolve, and it will force companies to have to adhere to different data privacy regimes in different areas. And so for a startup, it will be very difficult to operate across these different areas. However, then startups see this as an opportunity. So then there are other startups that set up data privacy compliance tech that allow you to stay within each regime more smoothly, and then even transfer data as necessary between each framework so that you can still train your model using data sets from different places. Even to the extent, this isn't really a multinational issue, but for example, the data privacy regulations for healthcare data are very strict in the US. So you have HIPAA compliance issues. We've seen startups that are creating synthetic data sets. So it's all fake data, but with the same characteristics as the real data. So you can share it without any privacy concern. But then you see alternative startups that are doing a far better job of anonymization and sharing controls so that you can share the original data set. And so both of these approaches are viable. But then you also have startups that are working just on kind of piercing between data sharing regimes between countries. So I agree with you that it goes in waves where suddenly there's a big change when Europe introduced a lot of their data privacy regime. It was very hard on startups. But now it's getting a lot easier because systems develop to allow startups to be able to take advantage. So I'm going to do just the last question, and I'm going to cheat a little bit because someone asked, Ji Zhao asked, can you tell us more about Tsingyuan's investment philosophy? And that's a great place for me to end. So anyone here that is looking to get funded or hear about a friend that's to get funded, we invest in the seed stage. So that means normally the first institutional round. So companies that are valued, say, below $10 million. We look for companies that are technical in nature, meaning the founder has developed a technical differentiation. That's as opposed to business model that's new. The technology itself has to be differentiated. And then we look for things that we think can be really big. And normally, the way it could be big is the market is big and the person is really good. And so we're pretty broad. 50% of our portfolio is software, 30% is life sciences, and 20% is what I would call frontier tech. That's like material science, semiconductors, other kinds of breakthrough technologies. And so we're pretty broad. And so everyone should feel free to reach out. So with that, I'm gonna just say thank you. We have a number of office hours coming up. I really appreciate everyone coming. This was great. I want to kick it back to Harry and the others, or if there's anything you want to say before we jump off.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for the presentation. It was really awesome. And thanks, everyone, for being here. As Eric said, this is the first time we're having this new style where we have a presentation followed by office hour, but we definitely look forward to having more of these in the future. So look out for those emails and sign up as soon as possible. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.